All right, never mind. I don't know. Thanks.
My name is Sir Orso President of Blackbrook. Quickly, sorry for the technical delays. I'd like to introduce not just myself as president, but the rest of our volunteer board. We have Mary Ann Wagg, our vice president over there. Becky Donaldson, our secretary. We have Mary Sanders, or well, she's on vacation. And then we also have our chair people, Pat Morris and Debbie Schuster have been doing our field trip stuff. And they've been taking us to some pretty cool places, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then we have Lori White, who keeps us all moving with telling people what we need to tell them at the right time and right place. So, um, and our new chair for refreshments, candy, special, and they'll be passing around a and John, Tammy and John, and they'll be passing around a clipboard so people can help stock us full of sugar so we can stay awake for our stuff. Because it's very interesting stuff, but I've seen the couple you built on in the past. What? And I will let Tony kick off whatever he needs to say.
Hi, everyone. Tony, I am, I guess, the official liaison between Lake Metroparks and Blackbrook Qualified. Naturalist here at Penitentiary Glen. Welcome to here. Many of you have been here many times. If you need the restrooms, they're out the hall, make a left. You'll see them down here. We also have our birding flyer on the back for bird birding programs. We did our first one a couple weeks ago. Thank you to those of you who came up. Marianne is there. Yeah, we had a few of you were here. We saw some cool ducks up at Veterans Park. The next birding walk is Saturday here at Penitentiary Glen at 8:30 in the morning. There's plenty of room on that, so feel free to sign up and hopefully we'll see some stuff. You could register on our website at lakemetroparks.com. And all that information is on our flyer as well as our whole schedule for the year for all of our birding programs. We've introduced some evening programs as well. One we did a couple weeks ago was the evening bird walk, which I really enjoyed once. Yeah. It was a lot of fun. The next evening one is at the end of April 27th, I think, Bay Landing in Painesville. So if you guys ever see me in the park, if you have any bird questions, feel free to ask. I'm going to turn it back over to Trevor to really get things going. You guys got a great speaker tonight, and enjoy it. Thank you.
So to get us out and about, last month's field trip was March 11th, and we went to the good old town of Shreve. And if you've never heard of the Shreve migration sensation, it's kind of like the free kickoff to spring. And they have maybe not for the past couple of years, but for years have been doing a thing. Everyone come down and start birding. So that was our field trip. Went down to the Shreve migration sensation. We had 6 people and approximately one species of birds that they saw down there. And then the next outing that is possible that you can join sort of a Blackbrook flag is with Mary Huey, who can talk about that little field trip, which is Friday, April 14th, right?
Right. It's going to be Friday morning, April 14th, from about 9:30 till noon. It's out at the newly restored wetland on the Ashtabula-Trumbull County line, which is sometimes called Grand Valley Ranch, and sometimes called Sugar. It's both have the same address, and to get you there. So we'll meet down there. It's about an hour from Liberty to give you kind of an idea of how far it is. And then we'll walk and burn 2.5 hours. You will need waterproof clothing because there is a ford get from the parking area over onto the road that we're turning off. And if you're interested in going, see me before you leave tonight, and I will take your email address, and early next week I'll send you all the information. And there's no limit on the number of people. Just let me know you're coming by Wednesday or Thursday before.
All right, sounds good. So the day after that, we didn't get enough already on Friday. Saturday, April 15th at 8 a.m. We'll be meeting at Sandy Ridge over in I believe North Ridgeville. And that's another great wetland area where you can see a lot of ducks and migratory birds. Like this is it. Because the day after April 15th is April 16th, the kickoff of Spring Bird Walks, which is the last 3 Sundays in April and the first 3 Sundays in May. And that is just, we are hitting it hard in April and May for birding if we are bird watching. So we'll put that schedule up on our website, but it's a good one. Another thing you can come to is our IBA walks. So last month at the Metroparks, we had 22 people and 26 species in part 1 of the walk because there's quite a large area to survey there. And then in part 2, there are 11 people that hung on for 19 more species at Wake Robin. And there's only 2 more left at that location before we switch our IBA walks or important bird areas over to Orchard Hills in Geauga. So look forward to that starting in May.
So this Sunday,
This Sunday. Spring Bird Walks, I already mentioned, that starts Sunday, April 16th, and they're a bit earlier. They start at 7:30 a.m. So if you show up a little late, you'll miss the crowd, but you'll be able to catch up. You'll be able to see groups of people wandering slowly through the woods. We are looking for volunteers to help with upcoming events, 2 birthday events, and a Fest of the Bluffs with as well as the Lake County Fair and more. So if there's anyone who wants to sit at a table and talk about birds with people, there are plenty of things going on. Yes. And we have our nominations for our Blackbrook officers for the term of July 1st, 2023 through June 30th, 2024. And those nominees are for President Becky Donaldson. Remember, if you're getting your home, you can be on the Blackbrook board. Vice President would be Allison Huey, Treasurer, Sitting Chair, Marion Williams, and Secretary would be Mary Ann Whalen. So Trevor Wursler is out. Sticking around with all the AV stuff. Yeah. And trying to get us out there a little bit. We vote next month. So someone's gonna have to announce that because we can't do it at the board. Well, you won't be in. True, but that's gonna be. And then we also have a raffle. Yes, we're gonna be right now. Yeah, keep that, buddy. The kind of person have a thermal bunch. Let's see, I've got 4 prizes, but we're only picking 3. We have that is more decorative than functional because you're supposed to take all those things out every night. We have pouches, and there's even a little button on it, so it could be appropriate for Easter recipes. There are 2 separate Sibley's Birding Basics and
the still sky burning. So this there's five things. Oh.
Oh, she is.
I'll go with that. Oh, yeah. Oh. The last three, 990.
990. Oh. Let's make the start a new rule. No.
No, well, it could be like, I just want to Larry wants to find here. Explain, I can give it to next one. Okay, let's see. Sarah's options. Okay, who is not impressed with my partnership? Oh, yeah. All right. Okay. This one is 994. This is so that surprises me. Okay. Line. Are you saying something, or is it my turn?
Just to mention that I will be here next month as well. When Adam from Department of Natural Resources or Department of Natural Areas and Preserves will be here to take us on the Headlands Dunes restoration. Have you ever been to Headlands in Mountain? Says,
Yeah, that's what I thought he was talking about. That other stuff?
tell what I'm talking about.
Lover stuff.
Lovers. Stay on lovers. Stay on something husband was doing.
Just have them persuade to that stuff.
But we'll hear all about what's going on with lovers from the Headlands Dunes area on the 18th. So from the 14th to the 18th, we'll cram in a whole bunch of stuff mid-April for Blackbrook here. But it'll be right here, third Tuesday, same time, 7 p.m. Now there. Now you now.
Is that every month, third Tuesday?
Third Tuesday of every month, September through May. Minus December.
And then June is our. So all of us are here to hear what Megan has to say about the let's see, what's the title of your program again? Managing, make sure I get this right. All right, so on the edge, grassland and early successional birds and the conservation efforts to see. Megan is the parks biologist for Lake Metroparks for going on 3 years now. And she earned her bachelor's and master's degree from Austin
P State University.
Okay. I would not have pronounced it. He's got a C. Her master's works on an insects for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill on seaside sparrows and success. And she worked as the avian ecologist, Western Connecticut for the Connecticut 3D Bird Atlas, and the Kentucky Biologist for Quail Throwers Grassland Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So he's an avid birder and hiker.
Well, it's great to see a lot of familiar faces out here. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight. I'm going to be talking on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I've worked with grassland birds now for going on about 5 or 6 years. It's a big passion project of mine because they're facing a lot of challenges that we'll get into during this presentation. So the question I often get from people is why in the world are we managing for open areas or early successional habitat? You know, this area is supposed to be nothing but forest. Why would we manage for grasslands and fields? Well, we now know that that old saying that a stream could uh, go from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River without touching the ground isn't really true. That's something that's still even said today. Now we know that there was a mosaic of habitats on the landscape. There were grasslands, there was forest, of course, and then there was a lot of in-between habitat. And so it's very important to remember that habitat is not static and never has been static. It is constantly changing. Before we came on the scene, things like lightning strikes would cause fires to open up the canopy. Beavers would dam streams and create wet meadows. Wind would blow down areas of forest, which would allow more light to reach the forest floor. River scouring would also take out trees along riparian corridors. And then things like insects, fungus, different types of tree diseases, and other types of damage would all cause different pockets of open areas to open up in this forested landscape. And so this is what has allowed for these grassland and early successional species to exist on the landscape in areas that we think of as forested. We would not have these early successional species in this area if this habitat had not been here. So this is an excellent image done by Revive and Restore, and this is looking at the canopy disturbance, specifically those caused by the passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeon was another way that our forest would naturally open up canopy gaps. These massive flocks of passenger pigeons would often kill trees, and this would allow sunlight to reach the forest floor. This would allow, first off, grasses and wildflowers to come in, which would allow things like meadowlarks and certain open-loving sparrows and bees and grasshoppers to populate these areas. Over time, as shrubs moved in, different species came in, things like your towhees, your song sparrows, more of those shrub loving birds, your chats. And then as that moved into denser and denser areas, those species until eventually over many, many years, it would eventually get back to forest. So whenever we're talking about early successional species and early successional habitat, we're talking from the grasses through grasslands all the way through really forest. And then it's also important to remember that humans also influence the habitats here in Northeast Ohio. But long before European colonizers came, native peoples were doing habitat management on the ground. We don't give native peoples enough credit for the amount of work they did to influence the habitats here. They were keeping areas open for game species and for crop fields and orchards of these native trees, and also to keep settlement areas open. They used fire on the ground quite a bit to keep these areas open. And then once European settlers arrived on the scene, all of a sudden we're creating more and more open areas, which provided a lot of opportunity for open species. Birds like bobolinks, their population levels increased quite a bit because of all the young little farms that were occurring on the landscape. And prior to heavy European influence, these species were more transient, where they were moving from patch to patch as succession was going on. But once European settlers came, these areas stayed open. And so there was more consistent habitat. And now, if we look at present day, we are losing our early successional habitat. This is, through a variety of reasons, but the big one is loss of small scale agriculture. Now we do big agriculture, produce a whole lot of crops. We are doing now what's called edge to edge farming. That's where no fallow areas are left. And unfortunately, this leaves no habitat on these edges for early successional grassland species. Also, increasing urban and suburban areas take over these old farm areas, these agricultural areas that were left. So you've got even less open area. On top of that, we have invasive species that absolutely love open spaces. And as they move in, we're losing the open ground. Then forest succession. Forest succession is a very positive thing. Don't get me wrong, it's important to have forest succession. But now, because we have also lost those natural disturbances that would open up the canopy, forest succession goes on and it stays forest. You don't see those pockets opening up like they used to. Things like we do not let beavers usually let things go all the way through wet meadow. We usually remove their dams. We suppress fire. We, are trying our best to keep these disturbances out so they don't impact our groups as much, which unfortunately has had an impact on this early succession habitat. And I'm sure you guys all remember this study from 2019. This was a study by the Cornell lab, and it really shook scientists and citizens alike to realize that we had lost 2.9 billion birds on the landscape since 1970. And in this paper, it demonstrated that this was not just the rare species, this was the common species. These were the non native species that were also declining. And all this pointed to landscapes were losing their ability to support bird populations. If you don't have the habitat on the ground, the bird cannot exist in that area. That's just as simple as it is. But it's important to note that that paper also found that some conservation efforts have really helped certain types of species to come back from the brink. Things like Ducks Unlimited and other waterfowl programs have helped waterfowl increase by 56%. The laws outlawing DDT have helped hawks and eagles and osprey to all come back from the brink as well. So it shows that if we take conservation efforts and focus it on a group, we can make real change. We can help reverse some of these declines. And the paper also highlighted that, of course, one of the main reasons for this decline was habitat loss. And like I said, if you don't have habitat, you cannot have those specific bird species that depend upon that. So if we look a little bit closer at this paper and what it discovered, for migratory birds, we've lost 2.5 billion migratory birds since 1970. That's 2 in 5 Baltimore Orioles. That's 28% population loss. A lot of migratory birds utilize early successional areas for migration, and also several of our early successional species are also migratory. Then we look at aerial insectivores. We have lost 160 million aerial insectivores. These are things like your barn swallows, your tree swallows, your nighthawks. All these areas, all these different species use these open areas to forage in. So that's 2 in 5 barn swallows. And then we look at the topic of this conversation. This is grassland birds. This is just looking at this one habitat. 720 million grassland birds have been lost since 1970. That's 3 in 4 eastern meadowlarks, 53% population loss just within the grassland birds. Eastern meadowlarks used to be a very common bird species in agricultural areas. You talk to farmers across the eastern United States, and they would tell you that they used to hear the song of the eastern meadowlark all the time, and that's something that they don't hear. That's a lot of that's due to loss of these small farm agricultural areas that allow that landscape. So these open areas are becoming increasingly rare. So now grassland, early successional, and insectivorous species, pollinators, which a lot of them depend on open grown wildflowers, and other open adapted plant and animal species are all exhibiting declines. Most of our open spaces are overrun with invasives, and these areas are often considered ecological sinks That's where there might be these open and early successional species there, but they are not reproducing. They are not becoming productive and contributing to the population as a whole. And then we look at pollinator decline. So there's not as many studies in the United States looking at pollinator decline, but that's going to be changing here pretty soon. But we do know that 49 native bee species are declining just within the northeastern United States, with 7 listed as rare or endangered. A study done here in Ohio in 2019 that looked at over 21 years of data found that there's a 33% decline in butterfly abundance over that time period. And it's a 2% decline per year, which is pretty close to what we're seeing in Europe. And this data also showed that it's not just the native species, it's also things like European skipper, which is a non-native species that are declining. So what we're seeing in birds is also happening in pollinators, where it's not just the native species that are declining, it's also the non-native ones. And so this paper pointed to that habitat loss and fragmentation is one of the main causes of this decline within butterflies, as well as climate change, agricultural intensification, and also disease. So if we look at this figure by the Xerces Society, you can see that 28% of bumblebee species are in decline. Rusty patch bumblebee was the first bee to be listed as endangered in the United States. Monarch butterflies have declined. In fact, I'm sure you all heard that this past year they were listed on the IUCN Red List as endangered. Now, they're not yet listed in the United States, but the IUCN recognized that the declines were severe enough that we are seeing, we're seeing severe declines in their population. And with that, 19% of butterflies in the United States are at risk of extinction. The once common nine-spotted ladybee that's being shown up here is locally extirpated in several different states where it used to be very common. 50% of leafcutter bees and 27% of mason bees are at risk. And so this is very serious. A lot of these species are using these open landscapes, and they're all also declining. So grassland birds and pollinators need less of this manicured landscape that we all love so much. We all think this looks very attractive. We need less of this with its non-native species and not enough habitat. And we need more of this. We need the native plants. We need the habitat heterogeneity with plant diversity. We need these open spaces. And so there's several conservation organizations that are stepping up to the plate to do something about our lack of native plants. There are federal efforts, things like the federal farm bill help landowners convert portions of their land into wildlife habitat. There's grassland specific programs within that. I used to work within one of them where we were taking agricultural fields and putting them back into high quality native habitat specifically for grassland birds and pollinators. Things like the National Park Service, National Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they're all planning and promoting native species now. There's also a lot of state and local efforts. Private lands biologists within each of the states help local landowners come up with a plan for their property to be more beneficial towards wildlife. Local park districts plant native plants and also do education programs to spread the word about the benefits of using native plants on the landscape. Local soil and water conservation districts often do native plant sales. And some local governments have actually put it within their bylaws that they have to use a certain amount of native plants in the plantings that they do for their city. So there are some encouraging signs within our state and local government. And then on top of that, our wonderful conservation organizations, of course, Audubon, Nature Conservancy, Pheasants, Quail, and Habitat Forever, Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, Xerces, American Bird Conservancy, Ohio Native Plant Month, all these organizations are turning towards native plants and trying to drive home the importance of native plants on the landscape for saving our wildlife species. And the list is ever growing. Yes. And so there's other cool programs like this program that Audubon and a few other programs do. What do cows have to do with grassland birds? Well, these organizations are working with cattle ranchers to use regenerative grazing techniques. So this is stuff like flash and rotational grazing. And what this does is it mimics wildfire on the landscape by rotating cattle through these areas and letting some areas stay fallow. So this helps to set back succession into more of that grassland period. And so it has a benefit for birds and it has a benefit for cattle by keeping them off the feedlots and a reduction in antibiotics. And along with this, there are programs for working land to promote both working lands and wildlife at the same time. Because agriculture is important to us. We all have to eat. And it's something that we just can't get rid of. But what we can do is make sure they work in a little bit more harmony with each other. Programs like the Farm Bill, Working Lands for Wildlife, and Northern Bobwhite Conservation Initiative are helping both wildlife and crop production coexist. So this photo shows a field border. This is a practice that a lot of landowners can do where they plant native plants along their fields and it helps to promote pollinators and some of these edge species. So this is a win-win. So pollinators can help the farmers out by pollinating their crops and also providing insect predators to go to the crops to get rid of some of those insect pests. Also, hedgerows help to provide shelter for some of these species like bobwhite from predators. Great. They also provide grazing management plans and also supplemental pollinator plantings within these landscapes. So it's not just agricultural area. There are some of these areas that are being left fallow now. And so it's important, to realize that native plants do equal a healthier landscape for wildlife. Native plants require less water than lawns to upkeep because they are adapted to the area. Help prevent erosion. They tend to hold on to the soil a bit better. They provide shelter and food for wildlife, of course, and promote biodiversity and stewardship within the community. And the great thing is they're adapted to local climate. A lot of times they can deal with the climate swings that we might have here. And so native plants, of course, support wildlife. Native plants tend to be way more nutritious than invasive fruits. Invasive fruits tend to have lower fat content. Native fruits fat content typically ranges from about 6% to 48%. And fat is absolutely crucial for migratory birds to put on to help fuel their migration. So often invasive fruits are typically just not giving them enough energy. Things like Sericea lespedeza, which is an invasive plant that was planted for things like northern bobwhite, they have now found that bobwhite can actually starve to death eating those seeds because they're not nutritious enough. Necropsies have been done where they've looked at their crop contents and they've been absolutely full of Sericea lespedeza seeds. But these birds have starved to death. Goldenrods are a great native plant. They support 115 butterfly species in the U.S. mid-Atlantic. That's a workhorse plant for supporting a lot of insects. They support 11 native bee species, and they're for monarchs on their fall migration. Monarchs need those fall nectar sources to help fuel them. And it's incredibly important to have those fall blooming plants. They're also important for wintering songbirds by providing seed as well. And numerous other species utilize native plants besides pollinators. Deer, turkey, songbirds, other insects, small mammals, they all use these areas for habitat and food. So here's some examples within Lake Metroparks that I just took pictures of last year. So like this Pennsylvania ambush bug is on this Joe Pye weed waiting for pollinators to come and pollinate the plant so they can eat them. So, they're providing an important service by providing a hunting ground for a Pennsylvania ambush bug. Dogbane leaf beetle needs dogbane to feed on. Red milkweed beetle and swamp milkweed beetle require milkweed. And the spring peeper was on this cow parsnip, picking off pollinators as they were coming to pollinate. So, all these plants have very important roles to play for many different species. Native plants are also important food for grassland and early successional species. Native plants support more species of native insects. And insects are absolutely crucial for nestling birds to grow and develop, especially caterpillars. So these native plants are very important just for grassland birds for their young to forage on. Native plants also provide important seeds for adult birds during some of the lean times. So, we've all seen goldfinches going to different native plants and picking off seeds. It's an important food source. And so invasive and exotic species are also just not good habitat. A study done in 2018 looked at residential yards that had non-native plants, and they found that they have lower arthropod abundance, which forced the Carolina chickadees to switch their diets to less preferred prey, which caused them to produce fewer young overall. And then sometimes they did not reproduce at all in these areas. So basically that means areas with higher non-native plants have lower success for Carolina chickadees and unsustainable population growth than areas that had more than 70% native plants. So the bottom line is areas with high proportions of non-native plants can be considered population sinks. So early successional birds and pollinators both need native plant diversity. And Lake Metroparks, we are doing quite a bit of early successional habitat management. You might notice that up at the bluffs right now, we're doing quite a bit of early successional management. We are getting rid of some invasive tree species to help set back succession in some of those areas and provide habitat for things like our American woodcock that are dancing right now. They need open areas to be able to do that. So the way that we do habitat management here at Lake Metroparks is we plant native seed mixes and shrubs. We have planted Hidden Lake this year, Lake Erie Bluffs, and we're planning to plant a few more areas where we are removing these non-native trees. We also remove invasive species and reduce woody species in areas that we're wanting to keep a bit more open. We also do mowing and we do rotational mowing in some areas to also help keep down woody species. Prescribed burning, we've got several prescribed burns planned for this year for Lake Metroparks, which helps set back succession and keep meadows in fairly good shape. And we also identify important bird use areas so we can decide what our management techniques are going to be there. So if we look at habitat restoration, which is the most important part of keeping an area a nice, healthy grassland or early successional area. First step is you're going to, whenever you're thinking about habitat restoration, we're going to choose a good seed mix. So you want to have a good diversity of species within your mix within each of the three major bloom periods. Early, which is late spring to early summer. Things like foxglove, beard tongue, and Ohio firewort are great in that period. Mid, which is your main summer portion, which would be black-eyed Susan, and then late, which is your late summer to early fall plants. So that would be things like New England aster, goldenrod, and ironweed. And this helps to provide food for pollinators throughout the active months. And if we're providing food for pollinators throughout the active months, we're also providing food for birds that also need to feed on those pollinators throughout the active months. And we also leave standing dead plants during the winter to provide food through leftover seeds and shelter from the elements. And with making a pollinator mix, you also want to have color diversity. You want to choose pollinator plants with a variety of color to attract different types of pollinators. Hummingbirds and butterflies like more brightly colored flowers. Your reds, your yellows, your oranges, purples, pinks. So things like this cardinal flower are really going to draw in hummingbirds and butterflies. Bees are more attracted to purple, yellow, and white flowers. So if you look at this obedient plant down there in the right corner, you can see there's a couple of bumblebees on that obedient plant. And then flies, which yes, flies are also important pollinators. They might not be bright and showy, but they are very important as well, like green, white, or green colored flowers. So it's important to have different types of colored flowers to provide for different types of pollinators. And so these are some common seed mix plants. Of course, I'm sure a lot of you recognize the milkweeds. Things like butterfly, swamp, and common milkweed are all great pollinator plants. They provide, of course, for the monarch butterfly caterpillars, but they also provide for a whole lot of other pollinating insects as well. Purple coneflower, black-eyed Susan, and gray-headed coneflower are what we considered powerhouse species within a seed mix. They tend to bloom pretty regularly within the first year. They are also showy, and they also provide great seed sources in the fall. And then wild bergamot is also usually included in a seed mix. It's also known as bee balm. Butterflies, hummingbirds, sphinx moths, hawk moths all love wild bergamot. So it's an excellent plant to have within a seed mix. Also, something that you might not consider is you also may want to add shrubs. So we often add shrubs to help soften the edges of a planting. That way it's not a hard line. These help to provide shelter from inclement weather conditions and also as escape cover from predators. It provides additional nesting areas and lots of food in the form of fruit, nectar, and insects. And it also helps to increase height diversity within your wood. So shrubs like ninebark, buttonbush, and elderberry are all excellent native shrubs to use. I personally love elderberry because it provides a lot of fruits, which the birds absolutely love. However, whenever you're thinking about shrubs on the landscape, you do have to think, what am I doing this restoration for? If I have a big field and I'm trying to attract Henslow sparrows, the last thing I want to do is to plant shrubs because Henslow sparrows do not like fields that have high shrub density. They want just grasses. Whereas if I'm doing a habitat restoration, say for northern bobwhite or one of the scrub shrub species, maybe maybe I want to plant more shrubs for escape cover. So it all depends on what your goals are. So pollinator plantings can come in many shapes and sizes. They can range from small gardens and plots below an acre to entire fields of 50, hundreds of acres. So smaller scale plantings are great for foraging sites for pollinators and songbirds. They're good for converting unused spaces in different areas like along buildings or sidewalks. And they're great for teaching and outreach spaces. Now these areas might not necessarily be large enough for nesting for some of our grassland species, but it's good for pollinator species in some of these areas. So a good example of this is we have pollinator planting in front of our Jordan Creek Park Center. It's a small little area. It's not big enough to have, a nesting Henslow sparrow in, but it's important food for like our butterflies. Whereas our large plantings are good for our larger, our species that require a larger area to nest in. So this is things that would be beneficial for like our Henslow sparrows that need anywhere from 50 to sometimes 80 acres for one breeding pair to utilize. And also these areas can support higher numbers of species and higher numbers of those individuals. So some examples of that within Lake Metroparks is our Stoke Meadow area. That was planted in 2011 originally. And since then, last year and this year, we have been planting additional mixes in there to increase the diversity of our wildflowers there. Pleasant Valley is another example of a grassland planting. It has a wide diversity of different plants. In this photo, you can see a lot of that wild bergamot. and also rattlesnake monster, which is a great plant for pollinators to utilize. And then we have Lake Erie Bluffs. Lake Erie Bluffs is an ongoing battle for habitat restoration. It has a higher portion of non-native species, which I'm sure you guys have noticed. But we are going through and we're removing those. And in its place, we are planting seed mixes. So this is an area right at the end of Lane Road next to the cul-de-sac. It's planted. Look at that high diversity of native plants in there. And that one little spot was absolutely teeming with bees and butterflies and sphinx moths, all in that main section. And so that's kind of the goal that we're working towards. So with grassland bird habitat, it's important to realize that species usage changes as early succession stage changes. So what's there at the beginning in your more sparse grassland, like eastern meadowlark and bobolink, are not going to necessarily be there as we move all the way through our scrub shrub. So once we get to scrub shrub, those eastern meadowlarks, those bobolinks, those Henslow sparrows, grasshopper sparrows, all of those birds drop out, and common yellowthroat, yellow-breasted chat, eastern towhee all take over. So you have to decide what your management goals are. Do we want scrub shrub, and that's what we're moving towards, or do we still want some areas of grassland where these more grassland species can exist? So with that, you have to have a couple of tools in your belt. So we use mowing. We use periodic mowing or brush removal to keep areas open and woody vegetation at lower levels. We use top clipping. Top clipping is where you raise your mower up about a foot and you top clip the heads off of invasive species. So a lot of our invasives get started long before our natives have started to spread. So by doing this, we're taking the seed heads off of the invasive species and allowing our native species some time to catch up those invasives. And whenever we do mowing in our fields, we primarily do it outside of nesting and other sensitive time periods. And we always leave escape cover for species throughout the year. Burning is another important tool in our belt. Burning, if it's possible in an area, is one of the most natural ways to set back the grassland in an early successional habitat. I prefer burning over everything else. It also helps to provide a wonderful surface to plant native seeds into because the seeds can contact the ground so much better. And it can also help in control with some of our invasive. However, burning is not always possible. A lot of our parks and lake Metroparks are very close to people's houses, schools, in the middle of very urbanized areas. So in these areas, instead of doing that, we do periodic disking. So that's where we will do a light disking just to kind of bring that soil back up to the surface. And this also helps whenever we're planting back in because we need to have good seed to soil contact anytime we're planting a seed mix. So we also have to do selective removal of woody species. So a lot of the areas, as they go through time, they start getting very thick. So in some of these areas, depending on what our habitat goal is, we do go out and remove some woody species to open the areas back up to provide habitat. And of course, we also try to remove our invasive woody species. Invasive removal is crucial for maintaining early successional habitat. Many of our invasive species here in Northeast Ohio love open, disturbed areas. And every time you disturb the soil, it opens the door for invasives to thrive. And so you have to remove invasives pretty constantly in the landscape. So things like autumnal, Bradford pear, Callery pear, which Northeast Ohio has put a nice law in place to limit the sale of these trees now. Bush honeysuckle, Asiatic bittersweet will all come into an open area and take things over quite readily. This is a list of just some of the invasives that we have here that, that will utilize early successional habitat. Things like Canada thistle we're seeing throughout most of our fields. Putney teasel and common teasel are pretty readily available as well. Black alder, which is a specialty of the bluffs, is pretty common up in that area, and we are currently working to eliminate some of those black alder stands. We would like to. It's a work in progress. It's a work in. Oh no, we're not saving any. It's just that's gonna be a process of many years. Unfortunately, we've got some very large stands of black alder. Bush honeysuckle privet, and of course your autumn olive. Purple loosestrife is very common in fields, especially those fields that are a little bit wetter. And of course, glossy buckthorn as well. We'll move out to some of those areas. So when we conduct management on plantings, we always leave a part undisturbed to be managed the following year. General rule of thumb is you want to leave a third of the area undisturbed to allow for escape cover for different wildlife. And you want to avoid conducting heavy management, of course, during summer nesting months when birds, of course, are forced to be a little bit more in place and you've got nestlings that can't necessarily escape like a prescribed, for example. And it's important to note without management, your pollinator and grassland plantings will eventually fade out. Even if you spend all this time planting this wonderful seed mix and you've got them for a few years without some sort of management, eventually those will go away as succession continues. So if we're looking at some of our common birds of the early successional habitat, these four are common birds of the scrub shrub. You've got common yellow throat, your brown thrasher, your gray catbird, and your yellow warbler, which all can be seen in one of our very scrub shrubby parks, the Bluffs. The Bluffs has quite a bit of each of these four species. You have your aerial insectivores like your tree swallows and your barn swallows, which utilize these areas for feeding. Indigo buntings like these shrubby areas as well. They like a little bit further into succession. Eastern bluebirds, your field sparrows, like a little bit more of a grassland habitat. And then, of course, your song sparrows love those really nice, dense areas of shrubs. Other species, American goldfinches, love to feed on different native plants within an open grassland setting. Wild turkey, grasslands and open areas are very important for what we call bugging habitat. So bugging habitat is an area where they can take their chicks and go through and pick bugs off of the plant. So it's very important in the summer months. Eastern towhees love scrub shrub habitat. And then right now, I've already mentioned it, but the American woodcock love early successional habitat for them to do their sky dances. And if you guys haven't seen them, which I'm sure a good proportion of you have, I recommend going up to the Bluffs at this time of year. They're dancing right now, and it's something that's worth seeing if you live there around dusk. Early successional areas are also very important for migration. These areas have a lot of food resources in one area. So some species that are not necessarily early successional habitat birds can be found in these areas, and sometimes at low heights, so they can be a little bit easier to see. In the winter, these areas are also utilized by some of our winter migrants. Shorter areas that mimic tundra are great for things like snow buntings and long spurs and short-eared owls, whereas our scrub shrub brings in white-throated sparrows and things like tree sparrows. And so I figured here at the end, we talk about some of the interesting early successional breeding birds that we have here at Lake Metroparks. Of course, eastern meadowlarks. I'm sure quite a few of you have seen them at Chagrin River Park. We've also had them breeding at Gurr Road there at Scope Meadow. Bobolink, one of my favorite grassland birds, pretty regularly seen at Chagrin River Park. In 2021 and 2022, we had 4 different pairs breeding there underneath the power lines. So that was pretty exciting. And we've also had them breed at Hidden Lake this year, which was also exciting for us because that was a new record for that park for breeding. We've also had them breeding at Girdle Road and Hogback Ridge. American Kestrel can sometimes be found breeding at Chagrin River Park whenever it decides to use the Kestrel box. White-eyed vireo, which is more of a shrub species, has been found last year. There was one nesting here at Penitentiary Glen. It's also been found nesting at River Road, Beatty Landing, and Arcola Creek. Chestnut-sided warbler, that's a shrub species that likes vines and thickets. One was found both in 2021 and 2022 utilizing an early successional area. And that was pretty exciting because we don't have too many records of chestnut-sided warblers using their different areas within Lake Metroparks for breeding. Blue-winged warbler loves shrub and vines and can be found at breeding at Big Creek Corridor and Lake Erie Bluffs. Yellow-breasted chat, usually a pretty fan favorite. In fact, it's also one of our bluff specialties. They love that shrub and vines, but it's important to note that that shrubby area can actually get too thick for them over time. And so they will eventually move on once an area becomes just a little bit too thick. Now, I don't know what in their mind, how they decide when something has crossed a line, but apparently there does come a time where that does happen. So this past year, of course, one was breeding at Lake Erie Bluffs. It's moving around a bit because its original patch, I think, has gotten just a tad bit too thick. And then past Lake Metroparks rare and uncommon breeding birds. These are birds that we haven't seen in quite a few years, but we do have records of. We've had a dick sizzle at Chagrin River Park in Hidden Lake breeding. We've had horned larks at Hogback Ridge. Grasshopper sparrows have bred at Hidden Lake. And Henslow sparrow, which is pretty surprising since that's a bird that typically needs bigger areas. One was seen breeding at Chagrin River Park and another at Hidden Lake. We've had Savannah sparrow at Chagrin River Park and Girdle Road. Vesper sparrow breeding at Hidden Lake. Nashville warbler, which is more shrubby, early successional, has been found at Big Creek Corridor breeding. Mourning warbler has been found breeding at Lake Erie Bluffs and Girdle Road. And least flycatcher has been found at several different parts, which is about more shrubby, early succession bird. So, I'm going to end this presentation with one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Seuss. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And that's just a fact with grassland birds and a lot of other bird species. Unless we decide to do something, we're going to end up losing some of these species. So it takes all of us. It takes us promoting native plants to our friends and family. It takes realizing native plants on the landscape are also important. Ohio native plants are just as important as those pretty ornamental plants that we may plant in our gardens. It's important for us to realize that these areas have value. And so if you go out and take that message to other people, maybe people start to realize that. And we can bring these birds back from the brink, just like we've done with waterfowl and our hawks and our eagles. So with your help, maybe we can do something. And with that,
And your colleagues at Lake Metroparks counter negative, and this comes from the birding community. You can't take out all those shrubs because the roots need them. Because we're dealing with invasive shrubs in the market, the Zipline Trail, and people are saying that we're butchering the other story. You know, it's good to for this ecological concept to should care about the birds who should be eating the right kind of food. So what's your story?
Absolutely, and that's something that we deal with constantly. A lot of times, some people might not realize that some of those shrubs are invasive species. So sometimes we have to do a little bit of education and explain that these invasive species are not as nutritious and good for these birds as we once thought. But it's an uphill battle. I mean, it is. There's no great solution, unfortunately.
Sure doesn't be carrying the torch for restoration.
You know what? We would really hope so, and maybe you guys can help with that. Is that these invasive species are just not beneficial for these native birds. I mean, you saw the study where it shows Carolina chickadees have less reproductive success, and Carolina chickadee is a very common bird. Less reproductive success in areas with higher non-native species, and that's probably a story that's across different bird species. It just hasn't been told yet. And so, we're hoping that we can help, you know, change the perception and show that like we're taking out the non-native plants and replacing them with better things. And some of, like you said, the understory, that's not beneficial if it's nothing but glossy buckthorn or bush honeysuckle or privet. You are choking out your native plant species that would support so much more. And it's an uphill battle. And I think it's just education, education, education. Unfortunately, that's the best answer I have for that. So back to you. Yes,
Sort of a related question. If you're trying to restore grassland wildflower meadow,
yes.
and you have to keep, the invasives keep popping up, you have
Yes.
to remove them. Is that forever, or after a certain number of years, do they sort of give up?
Oh no, that is ever and ever and perpetuating. Invasive, some of these invasive seeds can stay in the seed bank for as long as 20 years. So some of these plants, after one seed crop, you're going to be fighting it for maybe 20 years or more. So it is a constant battle because these invasives they're very good at what they're doing. That's why they're invasive species. They're very good at seeding at high rates. They're very good at moving into disturbed areas. And unfortunately, you're always going to have invasives. I wish that wasn't the case. It would make mine and Becky's job a lot easier if the invasives would just go away forever. Yes.
So in Lake Geogga and Ashtabula County, we have really heavy clay soil.
Yes.
How do you amend your soil if you're going to transition from fallow, vacant farmland to a wildflower prairie type meadow?
A lot of our plants are adapted. So I'm from the southeast. Our soils are all clay. And we have a lot of success with planting native plants. A lot of the native plants are adapted to that kind of soil. That's the great thing about native plants. And what you do is, not all native plants are good for all areas. But if you look at what each one's requirements are, and you pick those species that would do best there, and usually on the websites and stuff that you look at, they mention like what soils they do best in, how much water they need, how much sunlight they need. All these are mentioned, so you tailor make your seed mix. It's just, choosing, you have to choose what's best adapted for the area.
I got another question. So I'm a bluebird monitor for the Holding Arboretum, and by midsummer, I'm walking through fields that are knee-high in poison ivy.
Yes.
Is that considered a good habitat? The native plants? Is it considered a good plant for birds and pollinators?
It is actually native. Poison ivy, provides a lot of fruit for birds. And birds, they've got this wonderful ability where they can eat poison ivy and get in poison ivy, and they don't break out like we do. Now, poison ivy can create monocultures, of course. So sometimes you aren't getting the plant diversity that you want in there.
No diversity.
There's sometimes no diversity. So sometimes with that, it just is a little bit more management to bring in other, some people I've seen what they've done with that to try and bring in more plant diversity in heavy areas that have is a native plant, but maybe there's a little bit too much of that as they continue to flip it and allow the potential for other areas. Poison ivy is very good at what it does, but it does provide important habitat and food. It's one of those plants. Yes, Mary.
Question popped into my head when you were talking about the movement to get farmers to create some native habitat alongside of their crops. And that's a federally funded program, I think.
Yes.
So when that's done, do you know, are the farmers required to plant seed that's not treated with that pesticide?
So, you mean for within the pollinator
No,
planting?
within the crop.
Within the crop? No, they're not, unfortunately. That's something that has been talked about, but you know, things move slowly.
Yeah, it would seem like it's kind of it's doing the benefit
Right.
to your feet from pollen, you know.
Right. Well, I will say a lot of times that the farmers that are signing up for these types of programs that are trying to put these habitats back on the ground tend to be a little bit more open-minded to doing things over that are beneficial. People who are signing up for this are the ones that care anyway, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yes, Becky.
Would you consider birds nesting at the bluffs?
What'd you say?
Sedgerins, are they nesting at the bluffs?
There has been some talk about that.
So I'm hoping
It would. It would. So that we think maybe yes.
fact that they're there for a second.
Yes. Yeah. So we think that there's a pretty good chance that of course that they are, and they're pretty regular there as well. So yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out too that their team that does all this Social Lake Metroparks is the tiniest, smallest department in Lake Metroparks.
It is. So my department is a department of one. I'm the only biologist, and our natural resources department consists of two full-time staff and two seasonal staff.
They're doing a lot. It's
Yes.
I have a question about invasive or non-native crab apples. Tend to be brushed off the ground and left because they're food,
Yes.
they're not very native.
No, so we are changing that in some of our areas. It's been an uphill battle to change perceptions in that because it is considered wildlife food and it does provide nectaring sources and such. But we do have a couple of native crabapple species, but what you're seeing out in the fields are not native species. And that's something that we are working on to reduce those crabapples and hopefully move away from them in the future. It's better to have native trees. So, yes, Becky.
And it's for us.
Okay.
So there's too much of them. It's a restoration work.
Yes. Yes. That was because we had treated for glossy buckthorn in there and we were trying to get all of it at once. Because as you know, we have a huge glossy buckthorn problem and those fields were absolutely full of it. And so what we were doing was we were trying to do a mowing suppression this fall. And then hopefully this year, we're hoping that we'll have less. So that's kind of what the thought was there because those fields had unfortunately gotten away with us with glossy buckthorn. Yes. Yes.
I wanted to say that I live in Mentor, and Mentor has hired some naturalists in their city departments. And I think that's what we as taxpayers maybe want to work with our cities. I have not received on what is for them to buy into fixing things. Because cities have various lands. And I see some improvement because of these naturalists. There's more education programs going on now for naturalist-led programs. So I think if we can get cities more involved with accepting that, hey, this is your responsibility too, to not just let all of this area look like scrubland. But yeah, that's where I see we can do some work.
No, I agree. I think it's gotta be at all levels that we have to do this. And like I mentioned, that city that I mentioned in Massachusetts, it's written in their laws now that they have to use a certain percentage of native plants whenever they're doing any project in the city limits. And so, some governments are doing that, and I think City of Mentor is doing a great job with that. But I agree. I think we have to get in with our local governments as well, our fellow friends and neighbors, and it's going to take all of us to really put pressure and change the culture of, we need to plant non-native species, we need to plant native species instead. I think that's what it's going to take, is everybody kind of buying into that.
Like a minimum area, it makes sense to do native planting zone, like if you're not out in a wide meadow like that, thinking about, the flower bed next to your house in a suburban development.
Right.
Because you get counterproductive to do it on such a small scale.
Absolutely not. Native plants at any size, in any landscape are important. If you're providing food, pollinators, and native insects at that point. There is this movement right now with Doug Ptolemy. I'm sure some of you guys have heard of his work, of this homegrown national park, which encourages planting native plants at our own homes. And any size of native planting that you do is going to have some sort of benefit to the animals, to the pollinators, to just the habitat in general, to bring those back. It makes sense at any size. I recommend it. Just, even if it's just like a little spot, you're providing something for a bee, fly, or a butterfly.
All right. Thank you very much.